I should have walked away the moment she grabbed my hand. The rain was cold enough to sting, the kind that soaked through your coat in seconds and made every streetlight blur into gold and white smears. And I remember thinking I had exactly 10 steps left before I reached my apartment door, 10 steps before I could lock the world out and pretend the night didn't exist. But then I felt it. A small hand, trembling, desperate, fingers wrapping around mine like I was the only solid thing left in a collapsing world. And when I looked down, I saw her, maybe 7 or 8 years old, soaked to the bone, wide eyes reflecting something I couldn't name but couldn't ignore, fear that didn't belong to a child. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible under the rain. "Don't let them take me." And everything in me said this wasn't my problem, that I had bills to pay, a double shift in the morning, a life that didn't include strangers with haunted eyes. But my hand didn't let go. It tightened, almost on its own, and I nodded before I even realized. I was agreeing, before I understood that one decision could rewrite everything. "You're okay," I said, even though I wasn't sure that was true. "You're safe with me." And I led her the last few steps to my building, my heart beating faster with every foot of pavement we crossed, like something unseen was following just out of reach. The hallway smelled like old paint and cheap detergent, familiar, grounding, but she didn't relax, not even when the door shut behind us, not even when I locked it. Twice, her eyes stayed fixed on the entrance like it might disappear if she blinked. "What's your name?" I asked gently, kneeling to her level, but she just shook her head, lips pressed tight, shoulders rigid, like even her name was something dangerous. I grabbed a towel, wrapped it around her small frame, felt how cold she was, how hard she was trying not to shake. "You can stay here tonight," I said, the words coming out steadier than I felt. "No one's coming in." And for a second, just 1 second, her grip on my sleeve loosened, like she wanted to believe me, like she almost could. And that's when it happened. Not loud, not aggressive, just 3 slow knocks against the door, deliberate, controlled, the kind that didn't ask for permission because it didn't need it. My breath caught, my body went still, and I felt her freeze beside me, every ounce of tension snapping back into place, stronger than before. "He found me," she whispered, and something in the way she said it made the room feel smaller, colder, like the air itself had shifted. I stood up slowly, my hand brushing against the counter as if it could anchor me, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. 3 knocks, that was all, but it felt like a countdown, like whatever waited on the other side already knew exactly who I was and what I'd done. I told myself it could be anyone, a neighbor, a mistake, something ordinary, but my feet didn't believe that lie as they carried me toward the door, each step heavier than the last. And when I reached for the handle, my fingers hesitated just long enough to wonder what would happen if I didn't open it, if I pretended no one was home, if I chose safety over curiosity. But the silence on the other side wasn't impatient. It was certain, and somehow that was worse. I opened the door, and the world tilted, because the man standing there didn't look like someone who knocked on doors. He looked like someone doors opened for, tall, composed, rain sliding off a perfectly tailored coat like it didn't dare cling to him. His eyes found mine instantly, sharp, assessing, like he'd already measured every possible version of this moment. And then they shifted, just slightly, past me, toward the small figure behind my shoulder. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, the kind that didn't need to rise to be heard. "You brought her home," he said, not a question, not an accusation, just a statement of fact. And in that second, I understood something I couldn't explain, something deeper than fear. This man wasn't here to search. He already knew exactly where to look, and somehow, without realizing it, I had stepped directly into his world. My fingers were still wrapped around the door handle when I realized I had not taken a single breath since opening it, and somehow that felt like the only thing keeping everything from collapsing, because the moment I inhaled, this would become real, and he would still be standing there, watching me like I was a variable he had already solved. "I did not know she belonged to anyone," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, but it sounded small in the space between us, like it did not carry any real weight. His gaze did not leave mine, not even for a second, but I felt it again, that subtle shift, that awareness of everything around him, the hallway, the locked door behind me. The girl who had gone silent, as if he was mapping it all without effort. You did not ask, he replied, calm, precise, not accusing, just stating a fact that somehow made my chest tighten, because he was right. I had not asked. I had seen fear and acted on instinct, and now instinct felt dangerously unprepared. I swallowed, tightening my grip on the edge of the door. She asked for help, I said, and that felt like the only explanation that mattered. Something flickered in his expression then, not anger, not approval, something quieter, harder to define, and for a moment, the hallway seemed too still, like even the building itself was waiting for what he would do next. Behind me, I heard the faint shift of fabric, the girl stepping closer, and before I could stop her, her small voice broke the silence. Papa. It was soft, almost fragile, but it changed everything. The air, the distance, the tension that had been pressing against my ribs. His eyes moved past me fully now, locking onto her, and something in them softened, not completely, not enough to make him anything less than dangerous, but enough to reveal a different kind of control, one that was not about force, but restraint. Sophie, he said, and her name sounded different coming from him, grounded, certain, like it belonged somewhere solid. She stepped forward, her fingers brushing against my sleeve for a second before letting go, and I felt that more than I expected. That quiet release, like something important had just shifted out of my hands. He did not rush to her, did not drop to his knees or reach out immediately. He simply waited, and she crossed the space between them on her own, stopping just short, as if even she was measuring him. I thought you said to stay hidden, she murmured, and there was no fear in her voice now, only something small and uncertain. His jaw tightened slightly, a flicker of something sharper passing through his eyes before it disappeared just as quickly. I told you to stay safe, he corrected, his tone still calm, still controlled, and then, finally, he moved. One step forward, closing the distance, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, not gripping, not pulling, just there, present, and the way she leaned into it, even slightly, told me more than anything else could have. I exhaled slowly, realizing I had been holding more tension than I knew, but it did not leave, it just changed shape, because now he was looking at me again, really looking this time, not just assessing, but considering. Like I had moved from a detail in the background to something that required attention. You brought her into your home, he said, and it sounded different now, less like an observation, more like a decision being formed. I nodded once, unsure what else to do. She needed somewhere safe, I replied, and my voice did not shake this time, not because I was not afraid, but because I was beginning to understand that fear was not the only thing that mattered here. His gaze lingered on me for a long second, and then he stepped forward, crossing the threshold without asking, like the space had already been his. The moment I opened the door, the air shifted again as he entered, subtle but undeniable, and when the door clicked shut behind him, I realized something I could not ignore. I had not just let him in, I had stepped into something far bigger than a single night, something I did not understand yet, but could already feel changing the ground beneath my feet. Emily Carter, he said, my name precise on his tongue, and my heart skipped, because I had never told him that. You made a choice tonight, he continued, his voice low, steady, impossible to ignore, the kind that does not stay small. And for the first time since he arrived, I felt something stronger than fear rise in my chest, something stubborn, something that refused to back down. Then maybe it was the right one, I said quietly, and his expression shifted again, just slightly, but enough to tell me that whatever came next, this was not the end of the moment, it was only the beginning. The silence after his words did not feel empty, it felt full, like something unseen had settled into the room and decided it was not leaving, and I became aware of every small detail all at once. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft drip of rain against the window, the way Sophie stood just slightly closer to Luca now, her shoulders no longer rigid but not entirely relaxed either, like she trusted him but still remembered why she had run, and that contradiction sat heavy in my chest. Because it meant whatever world he came from was not simple, not safe, and somehow I had opened my door to it without hesitation. She said someone was following her, I said, breaking the quiet because I needed answers, needed something solid to hold on to. His eyes shifted to me again, sharp but not dismissive. She was not wrong. He replied, and there was no urgency in his voice, no panic, just certainty. And that unsettled me more than anything else could have, because it meant whatever danger existed was something he understood completely, something he had already accounted for. I crossed my arms without thinking, grounding myself. Then why was she out there alone? I asked, and the question came out sharper than I intended, but I did not take it back, because Sophie deserved that much. His gaze did not harden, but it did narrow slightly, like he was measuring not just my words but the intention behind them. Because she is learning, he said simply, and I frowned, the answer not fitting the situation. Learning what? I pressed, and this time there was a pause, a fraction of a second where something deeper passed through his expression, something that did not belong to control or authority, something closer to weight. That the world does not forgive carelessness, he said, and the words landed heavier than they should have, because they were not directed at me, not entirely. Sophie shifted beside him, her small hand tightening slightly against his coat, and I saw it then, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, like she understood more than any child should, and that realization made something protective rise in me again, stronger than before. She is a kid, I said quietly, my voice steady. She should not have to learn things like that alone. The room went still again, but this time it was different, not tense, not threatening, just still, like something had paused mid-motion. Luca's gaze held mine, and, for a moment, I thought I had crossed a line I could not see, but then his attention shifted, not away, just slightly, like he was considering something beyond the immediate moment. She was not alone, he said, and his tone was quieter now, less sharp, more deliberate. You were there. The words caught me off guard, not because of what they meant, but because of how he said them, like it mattered, like my presence had changed something, and I did not know what to do with that. I exhaled, slowly, shaking my head a little. I just happened to be there, I said, trying to make it smaller, simpler, something that did not carry weight, but his expression did not shift, did not accept that. There is no such thing as just, he replied, and for the first time, I felt something else beneath the tension, something quieter, something almost human, and it unsettled me in a completely different way, because it meant he was not just the man who had appeared at my door, not just the presence that filled every inch of the room. He was something more complicated, something I did not understand yet. Sophie tugged lightly at his sleeve, drawing his attention down. Can I stay here tonight? She asked softly, her voice small but clear, and I felt my breath catch again, because the question was simple, but the answer was not mine to give. Luca looked at her, really looked, and whatever he saw there made his expression shift in a way I could not fully read. Something protective, something careful. You will stay where you are safe, he said, and then his gaze lifted back to me, holding mine with a weight that felt like a decision being placed directly in my hands. And tonight, he added, his voice low and steady, that appears to be here. The words settled into the space between us, and I realized then that this was not just about Sophie anymore, not just about a child seeking shelter. It was about trust, about choices, about a line that had already been crossed the moment I opened the door, and as the rain continued to fall outside, soft but unrelenting, I understood something I could not ignore. Whatever had started tonight was not ending when the storm passed. It was only beginning to take shape. The rain outside did not let up. It softened into a steady rhythm that filled the quiet spaces between us, and somehow that made everything inside feel sharper, clearer, like the world had narrowed down to just this room, this moment, and the choices none of us could take back. I moved first because standing there felt like surrendering control, even if control had never really been mine. She needs dry clothes, I said, my voice more practical than emotional, and without waiting for a response. I walked toward the hallway, pulling a soft sweater from my closet, something oversized that would fit her small frame. When I came back, Sophie was sitting on the edge of the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, while Lucas stood near the window, his posture relaxed but not careless, like even stillness was something he commanded. He turned slightly as I approached, his eyes tracking every movement without effort. I handed the sweater to Sophie and knelt beside her, keeping my focus on her. Because it was easier than meeting his gaze again. You can change in the bathroom, I said gently, and she nodded, taking the fabric with small, careful hands. But before she stood, she looked up at Luca, not asking permission exactly, but waiting, and he gave a small nod, barely noticeable, yet it carried more weight than any words. She disappeared down the hall, the door closing softly behind her. And the second she was out of sight, the air shifted again, heavier now, more direct. I stood, slowly, brushing my hands against my jeans, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. "You did not have to stay," I said, turning to face him, because that truth had been sitting in the back of my mind since he stepped inside. He could have taken her and left, ended this before it began, but he had not, and that meant something, even if I did not understand it yet. His gaze met mine, steady, unreadable. "I do not leave things unfinished," he replied, and there was no arrogance in the statement, just fact, like gravity or time, something that simply existed. I crossed my arms again, not defensive, just grounding. "Is that what this is?" I asked, unfinished, and for a moment, there was something almost like amusement in his eyes, faint but real. "That depends," he said, his voice quieter now. "On what you believe started." The answer did not clarify anything. It only made the space between us feel more complex, like there were layers I could not see. And I found myself studying him in a way I had been trying to avoid, the details that did not match the danger I had expected, the calm in his expression, the way he held himself, not like someone chasing chaos, but someone containing it. And that contradiction made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. "You said she was learning," I said after a second, my voice softer now, less confrontational. "What about you?" His head tilted slightly, just enough to show he was paying attention. "What am I learning?" he echoed, and I hesitated, not because I did not have an answer, but because I was not sure I should say it. But something in me pushed forward anyway. "To trust someone you did not choose," I said, and the words hung in the air longer than I expected, because they were not just about him. They were about me too. About the fact that I had let a stranger into my home and was still standing here, not running, not pushing him out, just staying. His expression did not change immediately, but something in his eyes shifted, something quieter, more internal, like I had touched a thought he had not planned to consider. "Trust is not given," he said finally, his voice measured. "It is observed." And I let out a small breath, shaking my head slightly. "Then you have had a full night," I replied, because if observation was his standard, then he had seen enough already to make a decision about me, about this situation, about whether I was a risk or something else entirely. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, soft and careful, and Sophie reappeared, wrapped in the sweater, her hair still damp, but her shoulders less tense. She looked between us, sensing the shift even if she did not understand it. And without thinking, I reached out, gently smoothing a strand of hair from her face, the gesture automatic, instinctive. And when I looked up again, Luca was watching me, not with suspicion, not with calculation, but with something far more dangerous, recognition, like he had just seen something he had not expected to find. And in that moment, I understood something that made my pulse quicken. This was no longer just about the girl I had helped or the man who had followed her here. It was about the space between us that was slowly changing shape, something quiet and powerful, something neither of us had planned. And the more I tried to define it, the more it refused to stay simple. The apartment felt smaller now, not because of the walls, but because of the awareness that nothing inside it was simple anymore. And as Sophie settled deeper into the couch, pulling the sleeves of my sweater over her hands like she was trying to disappear into something soft and safe, I found myself watching her in a way that made my chest ache, because for the first time since she had grabbed my hand outside, she looked like a child again, not just someone running from something she could not name. I moved toward the kitchen without thinking, needing something normal, something routine. "Do you want something warm?" I asked her, keeping my voice gentle, and she nodded, small and quiet. "Hot chocolate," she said, almost like she was testing if she was allowed to ask for something that simple. I smiled without realizing it, turning to grab a mug, the familiar motions grounding me, the sound of the kettle filling, the soft click of the stove, and for a moment, it felt like I could pretend this was just an ordinary night. But the weight of his presence behind me never disappeared. It stayed there, steady and impossible to ignore, like a shadow that did not need light. "You make this place feel different," His voice came from behind me, low, measured, and I paused, my hand still on the counter. Unsure how to answer something that was not quite a question, I glanced over my shoulder, finding him leaning slightly against the edge of the wall, not relaxed, but not tense either, just present in a way that shifted everything around him. "It is just an apartment," I said, a little more quickly than I intended, because acknowledging anything more than that felt like stepping into something I was not ready to name. His gaze did not waver. "No," he said quietly. "It is not." And something about the certainty in his voice made me turn back to the stove, focusing on the rising steam, because it was easier than facing what he might be seeing that I could not. I poured the hot chocolate carefully, adding a few extra marshmallows without thinking, and when I handed the mug to Sophie, her fingers wrapped around it like it was the most important thing in the world. "Thank you," she whispered, and I nodded, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear again, the gesture coming naturally now, as if it belonged here, as if she belonged here, and that thought hit me harder than I expected, because belonging was not something I gave lightly, and yet here I was, offering it without hesitation. I straightened, turning back toward Luca, and found him watching us, not the room, not the door, but us. His expression unreadable, but his focus unmistakable. "You said you do not leave things unfinished," I said, my voice quieter now, more careful. "So what happens next?" The question hung between us, heavier than the ones before, because this was no longer about what had happened. It was about what would. His eyes held mine for a long second, and then he pushed away from the wall, stepping closer, not threatening, but undeniable, like distance itself had become irrelevant. "That depends on whether you understand what you stepped into," he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying something deeper now, something that felt less like a warning and more like an invitation I did not know how to refuse. I felt my pulse quicken, but I did not step back. "Then explain it to me," I replied, and there was a quiet strength in my voice that surprised even me, because fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. He studied me for a moment, really studied me, like he was deciding how much truth I could handle, and then his gaze softened just slightly, not enough to make him safe, but enough to make him real. "You chose to protect someone who belongs to a world that does not forgive interference," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "and by doing that, you made yourself visible to it." The words settled into me, heavier than anything he had said before, because they were not dramatic, not exaggerated, just honest, and honesty carried a different kind of weight. I glanced at Sophie, at the way she held the mug close. Her shoulders finally relaxed, and something inside me refused to regret it. "Then I would make the same choice again," I said quietly, and this time, I did not hesitate, because some decisions did not need to be reconsidered. His expression changed then, not dramatically, just enough to reveal something I had not seen before. Respect, subtle but undeniable, and it shifted something between us, something that felt less like tension and more like balance. "That is what makes this complicated," he said, and for a second, just a second, I thought I understood what he meant, because this was no longer just his world or mine. It was something in between, something we were both standing in whether we liked it or not. And as the rain continued to fall outside, steady and unrelenting, I realized that whatever came next would not be decided by fear, but by the choices we were both still willing to make. The quiet that followed did not feel fragile anymore. It felt intentional, like something had settled into place without asking for permission, and I realized I was no longer reacting to him. I was adjusting to him, which somehow felt more dangerous. Sophie shifted on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders as she sipped the hot chocolate, her movements slower now, calmer, and I noticed the way her eyes kept drifting toward Luca, not out of fear, but something closer to reassurance, like she needed to see that he was still there, that he had not disappeared the way everything else in her night had. "You can rest," I said softly to her, gesturing toward the couch. "You do not have to stay awake." She hesitated, her gaze flickering between us again, and then she nodded, curling slightly into the cushions, the mug resting carefully on the table beside her, within reach, as if letting go of it completely might undo the safety she had found. I watched her for a second longer, waiting until her breathing slowed just enough to tell me she was letting herself rest, even if sleep had not fully claimed her yet. And when I looked back up, Luca was already watching me. Not the room, not the door, just me. And that awareness settled deeper this time. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just present. She trusts you, he said quietly. And it was not a question, not even a test, just an observation. I exhaled slowly, leaning back against the counter. She needed someone too, I replied, because that felt like the simplest truth in a night that had become anything but simple. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, but I caught it, the acknowledgement, and it felt like more than agreement. It felt like recognition of something I had not expected him to value. And you, I added after a second, my voice softer now, more careful. You let her choose. His expression shifted slightly, not enough to reveal everything, but enough to show he understood what I meant, because he could have taken control the second he stepped through the door, could have ended this on his terms alone, but he had not, and that choice mattered, even if he did not say it out loud. Control is not the same as protection, he said, and the words landed differently than anything else he had said tonight, because they did not sound like a rule. They sounded like something learned, something carried, and for a moment, I wondered what had taught him that, what had shaped the way he stood here now, balancing something powerful with something restrained. I pushed off the counter slowly, stepping closer, not because I was unafraid, but because distance no longer felt like safety. Then what is protection to you? I asked. And this time, there was no hesitation in my voice, just quiet curiosity. He looked at me, really looked, and for a second, the room felt smaller again, not from tension, but from focus, like everything outside this moment had faded away. It is making sure they do not have to face what you already understand, he said, and his gaze flickered briefly towards Sophie before returning to me. Even when they do not realize it, something tightened in my chest at that, because it was not just an answer, it was a reflection of everything that had happened tonight, everything that had led him here, everything that had placed me in front of him now. I folded my arms loosely, not defensive, just thinking. And what about me? I asked quietly, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because somewhere along the way, this had stopped being just about Sophie. His eyes did not move away from mine, not even for a second, and whatever he saw there made his expression shift again. Something quieter, something more deliberate. You chose to step into something you do not understand, he said, his voice low, steady. So now you decide if you want to keep standing in it. The words settled between us, not heavy, not threatening, just real, and I felt the weight of them in a way I could not ignore, because for the first time tonight, he was not defining the situation for me. He was leaving it open, leaving the choice where it belonged, and that was more unsettling than anything else he had done. I glanced at Sophie again, at the way she had finally closed her eyes, her breathing even now. Her small form relaxed in a way it had not been when I found her, and something inside me settled with that sight, something firm and unshakable. I looked back at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. I am still here, I said simply, and it was not just an answer, it was a decision, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, because we both understood what that meant. The line had already been crossed, the door had already been opened, and whatever came next was not something either of us could pretend to avoid. And as the night stretched on around us, quiet and steady, I realized something I could not ignore. Staying was not the easy choice, but it was the only one that felt honest. Time did not move the way it should have. It stretched, slowed, like the apartment had stepped outside of everything normal and settled into its own quiet rhythm. And I could feel it in the way my breathing had changed, steadier now, less reactive, like something inside me had adjusted to the presence that once felt overwhelming. Sophie shifted slightly on the couch, her hand brushing against the edge of the blanket as if checking it was still there. Her face softer now, the tension that had once defined her expression fading into something almost peaceful, and I realized I was watching her the same way Luca had been watching both of us earlier, not out of suspicion, but out of awareness, a quiet need to make sure everything stayed exactly as it was, stable, untouched. She will sleep soon, he said, his voice low enough not to disturb her, and I nodded, even though I already knew that, because it felt like we were both speaking more than we needed to, filling the silence with something that kept it from becoming too heavy. I walked over to the window, glancing out at the rain that had softened into a fine mist, the streetlights casting long reflections across the wet pavement. and for a second, it almost felt like the world outside had slowed down to match whatever was happening inside this room. "Do they know she is here?" I asked quietly, not turning around, because I was not sure I wanted to see his expression when he answered. There was a brief pause behind me, just long enough to tell me the question mattered. "Not yet," he said, and something in the way he said it made my fingers tighten slightly against the edge of the window frame. Not yet meant soon. It meant this moment was temporary, that whatever safety existed here had an invisible timer attached to it. I exhaled slowly, turning back to face him. "Then you should not be here either," I said, and this time my voice carried more than curiosity. It carried concern, not for myself, but for what his presence might draw. He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady, almost searching. "You are not asking me to leave," he observed, and I hesitated, because he was right. The thought had crossed my mind, but it had not settled. It had not felt like the right answer. "No," I admitted quietly. "I am asking if staying puts her at risk." The room fell still again, but this time it felt different, more direct, like the conversation had shifted into something neither of us could ignore. His eyes flickered towards Sophie for the briefest second before returning to me, and when he spoke, his voice was even lower, more deliberate. Leaving would put her at greater risk. The certainty in his tone did not leave room for doubt, and I felt something in my chest tighten again, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever was outside this apartment was not something distance alone could fix. I crossed my arms loosely, grounding myself in the familiar motion. "Then we stay," I said, and the words came out simpler than I expected, like the decision had already been made somewhere deeper. His expression did not change dramatically, but something in his posture shifted, something subtle, almost imperceptible, like a line had been drawn and acknowledged. "We stay," he repeated, and hearing it from him made it feel more real, more permanent, like this was no longer just a temporary situation. It was something we were both actively choosing. Sophie stirred again, her eyes fluttering open for a second, and when she saw us both still there, something in her expression relaxed even further, like the presence of both of us together created a kind of balance she could trust. She let her eyes close again, her breathing evening out completely this time, and I felt a small, quiet relief settle over me, the kind that did not demand attention but made everything feel just a little lighter. I glanced back at Luca, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing immediate left to say. The decisions had already been made, the lines already crossed, and yet, something unspoken lingered between us, something that had nothing to do with Sophie or the situation, something that had formed in the spaces between our words. "You are not what I expected," I said finally, the words slipping out before I could reconsider them. His brow lifted slightly, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement. "And what did you expect?" he asked, and there was no challenge in his tone, just quiet interest. I let out a small breath, shaking my head just a little. "Someone who would have taken her and left without a second thought," I answered honestly, because that had been the image in my mind when I opened the door. Something cold, something detached, something simple in its danger. His gaze held mine for a long second, and then something shifted, not enough to change who he was, but enough to reveal a layer beneath it. "I do not take what is already safe," he said, and the words settled into the room with a weight that felt different from everything else, because they were not just about Sophie. They were about something else, something quieter, something that had begun the moment I chose not to step away. And as the night continued to unfold around us, I realized that whatever came next would not be defined by fear or expectation, but by the choices we continued to make, one moment at a time. The night settled deeper, quieter, like the world outside had finally given up trying to intrude, and for the first time since everything began, the apartment felt steady in a way that almost made me forget how fragile that steadiness actually was. Sophie had drifted fully into sleep now, her breathing slow and even, one hand still curled loosely around the edge of the blanket as if she needed to hold on to something even in her dreams. I adjusted the fabric gently over her shoulder, careful not to wake her, and when I stepped back, I felt it again, that shift in awareness, that quiet pull of his attention that never seemed to fade. I turned slightly, finding Luca exactly where I expected him to be, watching, not just the room, but the moment itself, like he was committing it to memory. She feels safe here, he said quietly. And this time, there was no distance in his tone, no calculation. Just a simple acknowledgement that carried more weight than anything louder could have. I nodded, folding my arms loosely, not as a barrier, but as a way to hold onto the calm that had finally settled in. So do you, I replied before I could stop myself, and the words surprised me the second they left my mouth, because they were not entirely a question, not entirely a statement, but something in between, something honest. His gaze held mine, steady, unflinching, and for a moment, I thought he might deflect, might return to that controlled distance he carried so easily, but he did not. This is not where I am supposed to feel safe, he said, his voice low, almost reflective, and there was something in that admission that shifted the space between us again, something quieter, more real. I let out a small breath, glancing toward the window, the rain now nothing more than a faint whisper against the glass. Maybe that is why it matters, I said softly, because sometimes the places we least expected were the ones that changed us the most. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was thoughtful, like both of us were standing at the edge of something neither of us had planned to reach, and for a second, I wondered if he felt it too. That subtle shift from tension into something harder to define, something that did not belong to fear or control, but to something far more complicated. I took a step closer without thinking, not because I needed to, but because distance no longer felt necessary. You said trust is observed. I continued, my voice steady. So what have you seen? The question lingered between us, not demanding, just present, and he did not answer immediately, his gaze studying me in a way that felt different now, less like assessment, more like understanding. I have seen someone who acts without asking what it will cost her, he said finally, his tone measured but softer than before. And that is either a weakness or something far more dangerous. I felt a small, almost involuntary smile touch my lips, not because the words were comforting, but because they were honest. And which one do you think it is? I asked, and there was no hesitation in my voice this time, no uncertainty, just quiet confidence in the person I had been all along. His expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for me to see it, that recognition. Again, that same quiet respect that had appeared before, only stronger now, more certain. I think it is the reason I am still here, he replied, and the words settled into me in a way I had not expected, deeper than simple acknowledgement, deeper than agreement. And for a moment, neither of us moved, because the meaning behind that statement was not something that could be ignored or simplified. It was something that had to be felt, understood slowly, like the way the night had unfolded around us, one decision at a time. I glanced at Sophie again, at the way she slept without tension now, and something inside me steadied completely, not because the danger had disappeared, but because I knew, without question, that I would not change what I had done. Then maybe you are not the only one who chose to stay, I said quietly, and his gaze held mine, unwavering. And in that moment, I realized something I had not fully understood before. This was no longer just about circumstance or necessity. It was about choice, about two people standing in a moment neither of them had planned and deciding, without saying it out loud, that walking away was no longer the simplest option. The apartment remained quiet, the night stretching on around us, and for the first time since the knock at the door, I did not feel like something was about to break in. I felt like something had already entered, something unseen but undeniable, something that was not leaving when morning came. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped in slowly, quietly, like it was careful not to disturb whatever had taken shape during the night. The gray light filtering through the curtains soft and almost hesitant, and for a moment, I just stood there, watching it spread across the room, across the couch where Sophie still slept, her breathing steady, her face peaceful in a way that felt earned rather than accidental. And I realized I had not slept at all, not even for a second, but I did not feel tired. I felt aware, like something inside me had shifted into a different rhythm, one that no longer measured time the same way. I turned slightly, and he was still there, exactly where he had been, not restless, not distracted, just present, like he had been part of this space long before I acknowledged it. His gaze met mine as if he had been waiting for that moment, as if he knew the second I became fully aware of him again. You stayed, I said softly, not because I doubted it, But because hearing it out loud made it real in a different way, he inclined his head slightly, a quiet confirmation that did not need elaboration. "So did you," he replied, and there was something in his tone that made the words feel like more than an observation, like they carried weight beyond the obvious. I glanced toward Sophie, her hand now resting loosely against the pillow, the tension from before completely gone, and something inside me settled with that sight, something firm and undeniable. "She is safe," I said, more to myself than to him. But he heard it anyway. I knew he did, because his gaze followed mine, and for a moment, there was nothing else in the room but that shared understanding, that quiet acknowledgement that whatever had been uncertain before was not uncertain anymore. I stepped closer to the couch, adjusting the blanket again even though it did not need it. The gesture more for me than for her. Something grounding, something real, and when I straightened, I found him closer than before, not enough to invade, but enough to change the space between us, enough to remind me that distance was no longer something we relied on. "What happens when she wakes up?" I asked, my voice steady, because this was the question that had been waiting beneath everything else, the question that would define what came next. He did not answer immediately, his eyes studying me in that same deliberate way, but this time it felt different, less like evaluation, more like consideration. "She goes somewhere she can remain safe," he said finally, and there was certainty in his words, but not finality. Not the kind that closed doors. Something about it left space, left possibility. I folded my arms loosely, tilting my head slightly. "And what about me?" I asked, and this time, the question did not come from uncertainty. It came from clarity, from understanding that my place in this had already changed whether I admitted it or not. His gaze did not shift, did not soften, but something deeper moved beneath it, something that made the air feel just a little heavier. "That depends on whether you step back," he said, his voice low, controlled, "or whether you keep standing where you are." The words settled into me slowly, not as a challenge, not as a warning, but as a truth I could not ignore. I looked at Sophie again, at the calm that had replaced fear, at the way something so simple had become something so significant, and I knew, without hesitation, that stepping back was not something I could pretend to consider. "I do not step away from something that matters," I said quietly, and the words felt solid the moment they left my mouth, like they had always been there, waiting to be spoken. His expression changed then, not dramatically, not enough to shift who he was, but enough to show that he understood exactly what I meant, enough to show that he had expected that answer even before I gave it. "Then you do not walk out of this unchanged," he replied, and there was no judgment in his voice, no attempt to steer me in another direction, just a simple acknowledgement of what that choice meant. I let out a slow breath, not because I was unsure, but because I understood the weight of it now, the reality of what staying meant, and for the first time, that weight did not feel overwhelming. It felt right, like I had already stepped into something that aligned with who I was, even if I had not realized it at the time. Sophie stirred then, her eyes opening slowly, blinking against the morning light, and when she saw us both still there, something soft and certain appeared in her expression, something that had not been there the night before, something that spoke of trust, of safety, of a quiet belief that she was no longer alone. I smiled gently, kneeling beside her. "Good morning," I said softly, and she returned it with a small, sleepy nod, her gaze flicking briefly to Luca before settling again. And in that moment, I understood something that went beyond everything else. This was not just a night that changed direction. It was a line that had been crossed, a moment that had rewritten something fundamental. And as I stood back up, meeting his gaze one more time, I realized the truth that would not leave me. He could control everything outside this door. He could command a world I did not fully understand. But inside this space, inside this moment, something else had taken hold, something quieter, something stronger, something neither of us had planned. And for the first time, I did not feel like I had opened my door to his world. I felt like he had stepped into mine, and somehow, that changed everything.